Hey, Griot fam, I'm Jaron Keith Gaynor, managing editor of politics and Washington correspondent at The Griot, and I am here with Congressman Gregory Meeks, who serves as the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Chairman Meeks, welcome back to The Griot. Always a pleasure to have you.
It's good to be on The Griot. Very good to be with you.
So earlier this month, the State Department released its U.S.-Africa strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa, outlining its new vision of priorities, policy priorities for the continent. As the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, can you outline why this is so important? And did you and your committee provide any input to the Biden-Harris administration?
But we did. And, listen, it's very important. The continent of Africa is the fastest growing in the world in terms of population. According to the United Nations, 3 out of every 4 people added to the human population in this century will be African. And fully 1/3 of the human population will be African by the end of this century. So what happens in Africa will be central to the history of the 21st century. And so what we do and our engagement with the continent becomes tremendously important. And of course, when you talk about on the committee, as chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, I continue to advocate for deepening our U.S. commercial and cultural ties with our African partners, including in areas of emerging technology, arts, media, entertainment, and financial services. So I communicated all of those things to the president. And you know what? We've had hearings in that regards on the committee, because one of the things that I stated when I became the chair of this committee is that we were going to remove Africa from the back burner and put it on the front burner. And so we've been doing that by our hearings, by our engagement, but also by dealing with and talking to the administration. And so I'm happy with reference to what they're doing in December in regards to Africa Summit.
In addition to this strategy that was released, Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited the continent recently, and the White House announced that President Biden will be meeting with African leaders later this year for a summit. And the last time, really, the world stage heard from a U.S. president in relation to the continent was when former President Trump referred to African nations as S-hole countries. With that as the backdrop, how important is it for the U.S. to kind of have this kind of refresh in terms of its relationship with Africa?
Yeah, the damage that the previous administration did to our relationships with African governments is very real and very tangible. But I'm happy to report and relieved to let you know that through my meetings and travels this year with people on the continent and heads of state, they still hold the United States in high regard. And so this engagement, this summit that the president is putting together is very, very important. For the United States, we still had a lot of work to do on improving relationships. And that was also true before the previous administration decided to take a tactical, piecemeal approach to diplomacy in Africa. So while the previous administration got Africa wrong, it is something that I think that we now have the opportunity to take advantage of. It is really important, this summit, and I thank the president for doing it and look forward to being engaged when it happens in December.
And in the U.S.-Africa strategy, it makes mention of the African diaspora. And as African Americans, how important is it for us to be a part of supporting Africa, and how can we do that as a country in terms of policy, in terms of uniting African Americans here in the U.S. And Africans across the continent?
Extremely important. When you have the voices of those of us on the continent, and we're talking about how we can work with these African leaders and civil society, so that the civil society, we understand, is important for them to be heard here in the United States, on the continent. It's important for us to make sure that we're talking about infrastructure and trade, AGOA, the African Growth and Development Act, that it is important for us to partner with some of our African partners on the continent. And it's a win-win as we do that. Win for the United States, win for, we could have, MBEs and Black businesses doing business with the continent of Africa and other partners there, and helping them build their infrastructure from within. So having our voices there is important. I attended a press conference yesterday talking about the African diaspora and the need for us to connect. So a deep driver into economic investment. And I just stress that because when I talk to Africans, that's what they're looking for, direct investment. So we should look at those direct investment opportunities. No one has better understanding, and we need to learn more and strengthen our cultural ties between African Americans and Americans and countries and the people on the continent. So it is extremely important that the African diaspora in the United States, but I think throughout the world, gets engaged with the continent.
And recently, the Japanese Prime Minister announced additional aid to Africa during its own summit in Japan. And the Prime Minister also called for Africa to have a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. Should the U.S. also take such a position either during our own summit later this year?
You know, having a permanent seat on the UN summit, the UN Security Council, I think could be significant. You know, I'm a strong advocate of diversity. We're talking about individuals around the world. We're talking about how Africa is the fastest growing country in terms of population. It's going to make a difference in the entire 21st century. So having someone on the Security Council to talk about the issues of security and other things is tremendously important. So Africa, the 53 nations on the continent, need to have that voice. We should lift it up. So I know I will support that. I will urge the administration to support it. I think that if we're really going to look at what the best thing to do for the future, where the great investments, and we want to make sure that the entire world is included, the continent of Africa needs to be there. Just about every other continent is. When you think about China, when you think about the United States, you think about Europe. We need a permanent, I think there should be a permanent presence on the Security Council for the continent.
And last question for you, Congressman. I noticed in this new vision the U.S. released for Africa, it often talked about standing alongside Africa. And I found that to be incredibly crucial because when you look at the history of Africa, there's been so much influence from the US and China and Russia having a footprint in Africa, taking its resources, investing in Africa, but Africa also oftentimes seemingly not being a partner, but being a passive participant in the geopolitics of it all. How important is it for Africa to be seen as its own sovereign continent, for African nations to be sovereign and to have to be partners and not to be led by world powers?
I think it's extremely important. Look, that's why, you talked about the UN Security Council. That means you're a partner. That means you're a part of. That means you're working together and you'll have your voice. And I think that's tremendously important to happen, as opposed to coming in and telling and trying to tell the African leaders and others what to do or how to do it. Make them real partners so that they give the opportunity, as I have when I chat with world leaders, and I'm going to meet with a number of them when they come into the UN. What I want to do is to hear them and then figure out how we can work together. We can make sure that, for example, by listening to them, when we have the USAID program, for example, going out to various parts of different countries into whether it's agricultural areas or urban areas, to make sure that we know what's there and that we are then helping them accomplish the goals that they're looking to achieve, as opposed to doing something that does not respect their culture, their history. So being partners, listening, working together, compromising together where compromise may be needed, I think is the way to go and the way to have a better, more peaceful, more interconnected world. We talk about now, we look at the global supply chain. Africa should be a part of that, We talk about the, chips and science. Africa should be a part of that as partners so that we can all grow. And then that way, I think that we will have better sustainability and a better tomorrow. And that's, I think, should be all of our goals, is to make tomorrow better than today or yesterday.